Tristan Brübach was born on October 3, 1984 in Frankfurt am Main. He spent his entire childhood in the Frankfurt districts of Höchst and Unterliederbach. He grew up as an only child with his father because his mother took her own life in 1995. Tristan did not have an easy life in an easy environment. Because his father left early for work and came home late, Tristan was left to his own devices at a young age. He had to make sure that he set off for school on time, made himself sandwiches, put on clean clothes, and do everything else that goes with leading an independent life, so to speak. And this independence also allowed him to develop a sense of responsibility. And he tried to deal with every challenge that his environment presented in the best possible way. He usually managed that, but sometimes he was still the victim of fights and thefts by other young people when he was walking around in Höchst. March 26, 1998 was not a special day, just a day like any other. Tristan's father's alarm clock went off at around 4:30 a.m., and he set off for work as usual. Tristan got up around 7 o'clock and set off for school a short time later. But because he had severe back pain, he called his father from a phone booth around 8 o'clock and asked him if he could go to the doctor instead of to school so that he could get a checkup for his back. His father told him to go to school first, and then to the doctor. The conversation between father and son lasted about 15 minutes. Shortly afterwards, he met his best friend Boris, who also went to the same school as he did, the Meister School in Frankfurt-Sindlingen. But before they went to school, they wanted to smoke a cigarette. But one cigarette turned into 45 minutes, and so they missed the first hour. Tristan did not arrive at the classroom until 9 a.m. At 1:15 p.m., he asked his homeroom teacher if he could leave school to see a doctor about his back pain. He told her that he had fallen from a tree the day before, but actually he and a friend were throwing stones at each other and one hit him right in the middle of the back. The teacher allowed him to leave, so he left school at around 1:20 p.m. Several eyewitnesses later reported that Tristan walked purposefully to the bus stop on the opposite side of the street from the school and took the next bus to Frankfurt Höchst train station. There are video recordings from a security camera of a kiosk at Höchst station on which Tristan can be seen between 1:46 p.m. and 1:49 p.m. Between 2 p.m. and 2:20 p.m., Boris, Tristan's best friend, is taking a bus in the opposite direction of the Höchst bus station and sees Tristan getting on a bus going to exactly that station. Boris gets off, runs through the Höchst pedestrian zone, which the bus has to avoid, and tries to get to the station before him, but apparently doesn't make it because he doesn't find Tristan and goes home again. At 2:15 p.m. or 2:25 p.m., one of Tristan's classmates sees him sitting on a park bench. The same is observed by one of his classmates at around 2:45 p.m. She later stated that Tristan looked as if he was waiting for someone. She concluded this from his gaze, which drifted in different directions. After that, between 3:20 p.m. and 3:45 p.m., he was seen on a park bench in the Bruno Asch Anlage, not far from the train station, by a woman walking her dog. Tristan was an animal lover and an extrovert, which is why the two of them started talking after Tristan had petted the dog. The conversation didn't last too long and the woman was on her way again. After a few meters, however, she turned around again and saw two men sitting down on the park bench to Tristan's right and left. That is the last time Tristan will be seen alive. 10 minutes later, at around 3:55 p.m., three teenagers arrive at the Liederbach Tunnel. They had been playing at a playground on Adelonstrasse, and the Liederbach Tunnel is an underpass not far from the train station that runs below the railroad tracks and is a shortcut that saves you about 10 to 15 minutes of walking. The three of them watch a man for 2 minutes as he, and I quote, bends over an object. They can't see the man very well due to the lighting conditions, the shadows, and the excitement of the situation, but they get scared and decide to take the longer route around the train tracks. 5 minutes later at 4 p.m., two other teenagers arrive at the entrance to the Liederbach Tunnel. They had also been at the playground with the others, but unlike the other youths, they decided to take the shortcut. They enter the dark tunnel and discover the body of Tristan Brübach placed on a concrete pedestal. This means that the youths who claim to have seen the man bending over an object were actually observing the perpetrator of Tristan's murder. The two run to a nearby children's home and tell a caretaker about the found body. After making sure that the children were telling the truth, the caretaker alerted the police at 5:08 p.m. and the investigation began. It is important to note that the population only learned about the brutal nature of the murder 2 or 3 years after it occurred. So the police's first investigative tactic was to communicate as little as possible to the outside world. Who knows why? Perhaps because they thought they had solid evidence pointing to a perpetrator and they wanted to lull him into a false sense of security. And after some time, they decided to change their investigative tactics so that the public would develop a different connection to the case and thus involve them and build greater interest in the case. Just for the sake of completeness. When the police arrived at the scene, Tristan's body was examined and the police reconstructed what happened as follows. Tristan must have gone into the tunnel with his killer, either voluntarily or forcibly. At some point, Tristan realized that something was wrong and tried to free himself from the killer's clutches. And he managed to do so. He was able to break free and move towards the exit of the Liederbach tunnel. However, the perpetrator followed him and overpowered him. He pulled him to the ground and hit him several times hard in the face until he was unconscious. The investigators concluded the latter from several larger hematomas on his face. He then choked him with his forearm and cut his throat from ear to ear with such force that the knife even penetrated to the spine. Then the perpetrator left Tristan to bleed to death in the water for a few minutes, which implies that the perpetrator must have had a certain amount of time to himself. After about 10 minutes, he carried Tristan to the place where he was finally laid out on the concrete base. This was in the middle of the tunnel and about 28 meters away. Post-mortem, a piece of tissue and muscle about 20 by 10 centimeters in size was removed from the thigh, buttocks, and knee. In total, it was almost 2 kilograms of flesh. He then placed Tristan on a concrete base in a sleep-like position. Investigators said that this was unique. This formulation sounds strange at first, but what is meant is the modus operandi. This describes the way in which a perpetrator kills his victim, or rather, how he carries out the act. The perpetrator even took his time because he went back to the scene of the fight because Tristan had lost a shoe there. There has never been such a modus operandi before, which is why the police initially assumed that this might be the first crime of a serial killer who has now tasted blood and will kill again. But if he had killed again, according to the profilers, it would have happened to Tristan shortly after the crime. And since this did not happen, the investigators assumed that it was a targeted act against Tristan. The reason for this is still unknown today, but we will discuss possible explanations in more detail later. It should be noted here that the assessments of the profile have varied over the years. Initially, it was assumed that the crime was sexually motivated because the perpetrator was observed by the 3 youths during the crime, and, in the eyes of the investigators, did not notice this because he saw red or because voyeurism was part of his pathological fantasy and part of his game. The removal of the testicles with a targeted cut at the perineum also supported this theory. In addition, after he had finished his actions, the perpetrator tried to cover up and disguise the wounds he had inflicted on Tristan. He put his trousers back on him and tried to cover his face with Tristan's jacket, thus also concealing the hematomas. He placed his shoes precisely on the cuts on his hips and thighs. Experts speak of a so-called undoing. The feeling of remorse arises in the perpetrator, and he tries to undo the acts he has committed because he cannot bear the victim's gaze. But the question here is whether he really did it for these reasons, or possibly to buy himself time and be able to escape unobserved. So, if someone enters the tunnel and sees a person hiding there, they might mistake them for a homeless person sleeping there and thus not call the police directly. The time and meticulous effort the perpetrator put into positioning the body suggests that this was just as important to him as removing the body parts. After that, he disappeared from the tunnel and was never seen again. On April 7, 1998, the day before Tristan's funeral, the police received a phone call from a man. This man said he was the culprit in the Tristan case. Here is the audio track.
Polizei? Hier ist Tristan Mörder. Wie bitte? Tristan Mörder ist hier. Sind Sie? Ja. Und Sie wollen sich selber stellen, oder was? Ja. Ja? Wo sind Sie denn jetzt? Frankfurt Höchst. Frankfurt Höchst? Ja, und wo dort? Am Höchst Bahnhof. Am Bahnhof? Ja. Ich hab ihn umgebracht. Sie haben ihn umgebracht? Ja. Wie sehen Sie denn aus? Wie groß? 1,80. 1,80. Haare? Schwarze. Schwarze Haare. Lange oder kurz? Lange. Lange Haare. Nehmen Sie mich fest.
The voices are a little distorted. Unfortunately, I couldn't find the original recording and I don't think it still exists. The caller identifies himself as Dirk Meyer. He says he is about 1.80 meters tall and has long black hair. He speaks with a strong regional dialect and says that he is standing at the train station in Frankfurt Höchst and wants to turn himself in. The police went straight to the scene. But when they arrived, there was no one there. For a while, starting in September 1998, you could call a phone number to hear the voice nationwide in the hopes of identifying the culprit by his voice. And if the caller really was the culprit, then it can be assumed that the case will be undone. But as you can imagine, the caller has not been identified to this day. The police consider the call to be a possible red herring because, as you will soon find out, the appearance that the caller claims to have, according to his own statements, is the exact opposite of the appearance that witnesses say the culprit had. The police sketch, which was later presented to the public, showed a man who was a little shorter, 5 feet 9 inches tall, and had blonde hair. However, it is debatable whether the public would have really noticed a difference in height. Therefore, the police did not attach much importance to the call. However, various voices are speaking out against the police theory and saying that more attention should have been paid to the call itself. For example, a private individual said that if you listen to the audio track, you can hear animal noises in the background. Which makes me wonder what Dietz would have been able to deduce from this, since either way, the police don't and never have had a suspect. So, what could they have done with this information if it were true? The police even responded to the speculations of the private individual and countered that these were only distortions and not animal noises. What is also interesting about the call is that someone said that it sounds like the caller is saying Tristian and not Tristan. If this were really the case and not just part of his dialect, then it would probably speak against the theory of undoing. Because someone who really feels regret will have also looked through newspapers and read about the case. And he probably wouldn't pronounce the name incorrectly if he was really consumed by regret. Nevertheless, it is difficult to say whether the investigators have checked the call sufficiently because we as the public do not learn everything. So any further investigation would be mere speculation and accusations. What I didn't mention just yet, because it's difficult to create a meaningful and comprehensible chronology, is the discovery of Tristan's backpack. It is known that he had a backpack with him on the day of the crime, and the investigators assume that the perpetrator used it to transport the body parts, and that is why it was not found. But a year later, this backpack was found about 20 kilometers from the scene of the crime. In a wooded area inside was a map of Germany in Czech and a gas cooker. An old combat knife and the ring of a Czech gas and electric cooker were found nearby. Although this information should be taken with a pinch of salt, as it is only spread by internet forums that refer to the location of the backpack in the crime scene photos. However, I could no longer find these. Either way, this information is not too important, because shortly after the find was made public, a witness reported to the police that she had seen a man coming out of the woods and had a short conversation with him in which he told her that he came from the Czech Republic and wanted to go to France on foot. He also told her that he was a former member of the Foreign Legion, and indeed this man could be identified. He had meanwhile rejoined the Foreign Legion and was questioned. At the time of the crime, he was in a hospital in Prague and appeared to have a, in quotes, street paralysis, which is why the investigators assumed that he had probably found the backpack somewhere. He had an alibi for his stay in the hospital and was therefore quickly eliminated as a suspect. Unfortunately, another lead that went nowhere. Nevertheless, I find it remarkable that a person could be found through a chance encounter with a woman. Tristan had school supplies in his backpack, and these were actually found at the scene. I didn't mention that either, and a bloody fingerprint was found in one of the school notebooks. A glimmer of hope that was forensically examined for several months. And in the end, it turned out that the fingerprint was not Tristan's, which in turn means that it can most likely be attributed to the culprit. They are only genetic microtraces, but they can be the culprit's undoing when compared. The fingerprint was also compared with all international databases, but unfortunately, it led nowhere. But investigators did not give up. A test procedure was used for the first time in Frankfurt, a so-called serial investigation. This is a systematic test procedure that is used to filter out elements within a defined test area that have certain properties. And in this case, certain properties are the fingerprint. Starting in 2002, the police systematically checked the districts of Höchst and Unterliederbach. They took the fingerprints of men between the ages of 15 and 45 from the districts and created a database. As already mentioned, the initial assumption was that the crime involved blood, but later the investigators theorized that the perpetrator knew Tristan, and if that was the case, it was likely that he came from the same or at least neighboring district. By the end of 2003, 92.95% of the Unterliederbach residents and 98.65% of the Höchst residents had given a fingerprint, but unfortunately, there was no match. 54 men did not give a fingerprint, and speculation arose that one of them might be the murderer, because it is also clear that the perpetrator would most likely not voluntarily give up his fingerprint. There is another incident worth mentioning. In October 1999, an unknown person snuck into Höchst Cemetery at night and desecrated the grave of Tristan. He placed soil neatly on plastic sheets next to the grave, but seems to have been caught in the act and had to abandon his plan to dig up Tristan's coffin and disappear. Unfortunately, nothing more is known about the incident. Nevertheless, it is possible that this is the culprit who still feels magically drawn to his murder victim. And this incident shows parallels to an incident that Harun will tell us about later. Let's now move on to the sightings of the various witnesses and the resulting sketch. The first description of the perpetrator is based on the testimony of one of the 12-year-olds who observed the perpetrator during the crime and will be published in the Frankfurter Rundschau on April 2nd. The man, estimated to be between 18 and 25 years old, had his hair tied in a ponytail. He was wearing a baseball cap, a black leather jacket, and dark jeans. The man is said to be broad-shouldered and athletic. A month earlier, in March, a different youth had reportedly been seen at the scene of the crime matching this description. On the same day, investigators were told by two paralegals that a young man had contacted them at the law firm and said that he had just been released from prison but had already screwed up again. However, because their law firm did not specialize in such crimes, they referred him to a suitable law firm. According to their statements, the man was between 20 and 30 years old, 1.75 meters tall, and had long, dark blonde hair that was tied in a braid. He is said to have had a characteristic vertical mark on his upper lip and to have spoken without a noticeable accent or dialect. A week later, a father contacted the police. He said that his son and other children from the Vincent's house in Hofheim had been molested by a man with a plait. He's even said to have managed to persuade a boy to go with him to Höchst to buy sweets there. Harun, my source from Frankfurt, will later also bring in his own experiences regarding this man, which explain these encounters and the connections in more detail. And with this information, a sketch was created by Leon Bellman, an employee of the Hessian LKA, and presented to the public on March 26, 2008, 10 years after the crime against Tristan Brübach. This is the sketch that was created at the time and that many of you will know. It is a composite of the various witness statements. What was not included is the description of the caller's appearance, which shows once again that the police consider this to be unimportant or a false lead. Later, a former tutor of Tristan reported that she had seen Tristan only a few days before his death, with a man who looked very similar to the sketch and the descriptions of the eyewitnesses. What is also important to note is that the investigator at the time, Rudolf Thomas, handed over the management of the case to Uwe Fey in 2002. He reopened the case and considered Zopfmann to be the main suspect. One could speculate that this means that the Zopfmann lead was not followed up on initially, and thus precious time was lost. First, we will discuss Tristan's possible connections to the criminal underworld. In April 1998, shortly after the crime, an article appeared in the Frankfurter Neuen Presse, in which the investigators commented and presented a somewhat different picture of the innocent, well-educated boy. They said that Tristan had often gotten into trouble and sometimes did not come home for days due to his forced independence. However, the father never reported this, which is why it can be assumed that this happened quite often. But not only the investigators commented on this, but also Hadayatullah Hübsch, an author who wrote a book called Jugend und Jugendkultur in Hessen, ein Lesebuch Tristan, or The Sadness of Violence, and addressed the case. He made explosive comments in the book and linked Tristan to the criminal milieu of Frankfurt. According to his statements, he was often the offender and not just the victim. Tristan often had more money in his pocket than a 13-year-old should have. My source in Frankfurt told me the same thing. Tristan was able to afford things that other teenagers his age couldn't. For example, he always had cigarettes and sweets for himself and for others. According to Hübsch, Tristan must have been part of a criminal enterprise. However, he leaves open the extent and manner in which. Harun will tell you in more detail later on how Tristan might have come by the money. I tried to check Harun's authenticity as well as possible in advance, and, in my opinion, he is 100% authentic. Nevertheless, it must be emphasized that what he will tell you later is all subjective assessments and stories, which is why I tried not to let his statements influence me much in the first part of the documentary. Hübsch also writes that Tristan's death was a relief for some people in the area around Höchst. This is a very crass formulation, and I would like to stress once again that I am relying on Hübsch here, but if it is true, it would change the image of Tristan drastically. In various internet forums, it is also speculated that he may have acted as a kind of drug courier and that he met with his client at the Liederbach tunnel because he hid his drugs there and he wanted to hand them over. Even if these speculations are not true, the core question behind the statement is essential. Why did Tristan go to the Liederbach tunnel with his murderer? Until the fight, it seems voluntary, precisely because the time from the park bench with the two men to the act in the tunnel is very short. Here is another statement from Maria Haas, Tristan's former tutor. In an interview with Spiegel TV, she says something similar to, "Well, but he was a pretty boy after all." This formulation naturally evokes associations with a specific criminal milieu that people don't like to talk about, but which is real. and Harun told me that the Bruno Arschanlage was a kind of drug-dealing place at the time, and partly still is today, but it also served other shady businesses. Tristan was also said to have often been seen wandering around this area, and that naturally makes you listen carefully. What is a child doing in a gathering place of people who often have to turn to crime to survive, and often cross the line into illegality in the process? If you draw this connection between the criminal milieu of Höchst and Tristan, you also have to ask yourself at the same time whether Tristan really wanted to leave school because of a doctor's visit. Perhaps he actually had a meeting with the men he was seen with on the park bench, because he seemed to have gone purposefully from school to the bus and driven in the direction of the main train station. Furthermore, according to his classmate, he looked as if he was waiting for someone. And here we are perhaps at the right point in time to note the inconsistencies in Tristan's daily routine. As already mentioned, it is not all that easy to create a meaningful chronology in this case. Nevertheless, I hope that it is comprehensible up to this point. If Tristan really had such extreme back pain, why did he relax by smoking a cigarette with Boris in front of the school instead of going to the doctor? Maybe he really had back pain, but it wasn't that bad, and he made up the excuse that morning so that he could use it later to convince the teacher not to call his father. Besides, we said that Tristan left school around 1:30 p.m. and took the bus to Frankfurt Höchst. Boris, his best friend, said that he saw him on a bus to the Höchster Bahnhof between 2 and 2:20 p.m. A camera at the Höchster Bahnhof recorded Tristan between 1:46 and 1:49 p.m. This means that either Boris was mistaken about the time, or Tristan went somewhere shortly after he was seen on the security camera, away from the train station, and then back to it. But what reason could he have had for that? And the kiosk recording itself is also very strange according to some opinions, so we will now take a closer look at it. First of all, the quality is extremely poor, which makes any speculation that arises from it even more difficult. But you can see Tristan walking past the entrance of the kiosk. It looks like Tristan is turning to the man who can be seen right next to him, and it looks like the two exchange glances and look at each other briefly before he continues on his way. The man is hard to see, but he seems to have black hair, be a little taller and wear glasses. And if we assume that this brief, pixelated glance really means something, then it can be assumed that Tristan has arranged to meet this man at the train station. It's difficult to say why, but if you add the possible connection to the criminal milieu and the fact that Tristan had too much money for a 13-year-old, it leaves a bad taste in your mouth. But as I said, it's really difficult to tell from this short, pixelated video clip whether the two knew each other. What do you think? Could this brief glimpse mean something? Feel free to write me in the comments. The police never publicly searched for this man. In internet forums, however, he is sometimes portrayed as a key figure. But who knows? Maybe the police have even investigated him, but have not informed the public. What can be said is that this short video clip leaves a lot of room for speculation, and if you get lost in that speculation, it makes an awful lot of sense. I would at least not rule out the possibility that the man seen in the video plays a more important role than some might think. What is also worth mentioning is the situation of the two men who sat down to the right and left of Tristan. These two men were never identified, although they are at least important witnesses, but perhaps even accomplices. It is often said that they look, quote, Mediterranean, although this is of course an outdated and vague term that is not really descriptive. Nevertheless, it is worth mentioning because it is mentioned again and again in this context. The man with the ponytail, on the other hand, is never described in terms of his ethnicity, which means that neither of the two men was the man with the ponytail. We recall that the dog owner saw Tristan on the park bench between 3:15 and 3:20 p.m. She started talking to him after he had petted the dog. When she left, she turned around again and saw the two men sitting down with Tristan. A classmate had seen him sometime before and said that he looked like he was waiting for someone. The fact that people were sitting down to the right and left of him seems intimidating, but at the same time it seems deliberate, as if they knew Tristan. Does this mean that Tristan was waiting for these two men? And if so, why? And who were the men? What did he have to do with them? Did these two men have something to do with the man with the ponytail? Or possibly with the man who can be seen on the security camera? The time intervals are too short for us to consider this situation separately from the crime that took place only 10 minutes later and about 500 meters from the Bruno-Asch-Anlage. Precisely because the walk to the tunnel takes another 5 minutes. I have read the chronology so many times, but I don't understand what should have happened in the 10 minutes if they have nothing to do with Tristan's murder. Let's say they sit down with him. They probably linger there for at least a minute, if not longer, because they will have had some kind of conversation with him, whether they knew him or not. After that, he sets off alone or with them to the tunnel. This gives a time window of 4 minutes, during which he says goodbye to the two men and is taken over by the perpetrator in quotation marks. A really too small time frame for the two men, at least in my opinion, not to play a role. But again, the hint, maybe the police has information that they have not shared with the public and that really declares the two men as unimportant, because they have never publicly searched for him, although they were the last to see Tristan alive. If you notice any more inconsistencies, please feel free to write them in the comments. I will create a comment in which I summarize all further inconsistencies and pin them at the top. Thanks in advance. Let's move on to the possible theories. On August 26, 2014, Manfred Seel died in Schwalbach am Taunus. He lived an unassuming middle-class life. He played saxophone in a jazz band and was described by his neighbors as a friendly and unremarkable man. After his death, however, his daughter and her husband cleared out his apartment and various rented garages and made a gruesome discovery in one of the garages. They found decomposed body parts in a blue barrel. Shocked, they immediately informed the police, and the investigation into the case of their father, Manfred Seel, began. It turned out that the friendly neighbor had led a double life. Investigators now believe that he brutally murdered at least 5 women in the Frankfurt area between 1971 and 2004. These allegations were made by investigators based on the body parts found in the blue barrel. Frank Herrmann, an investigator in the Manfred Seel case, said the following during a press conference. "Sometimes it's a right leg, sometimes a left arm. If you add that up, you can actually use it to create a new body." The murders were characterized by extreme brutality and destructiveness, which was most likely driven by sexual sadism, which cannot be ruled out in the case of Tristan Brübach either. During the investigation, the police suggested that he might have had an accomplice because possible traces and the extreme injuries on one of the corpses could only have been caused by the interaction of a second person. Experts also say that he was not just concerned with emotional offenses, but with very stringent actions, which is another similarity to the Tristan case, because they also said this about the perpetrator in the second published profile of the perpetrator of Tristan. For this reason, and because the modus operandi in a murder case, where Manfred Seel arranged the shoes of the victim in a certain pattern in pairs next to her body, showed parallels to Tristan, they linked Manfred Seel to Tristan Brübach. The arrangement of the shoes is at least partly similar to the undoing in the Tristan Brübach case. The big obvious difference, however, is that Manfred Seel's victims were exclusively older women, at least according to the current state of the investigation. Older women who, however, belonged to the high-risk group and often stayed at train stations. And the main bus station and the Bruno-Asch-Anlage were only 7 kilometers and 11 minutes away from Manfred Seel's home in Schwalbach, west of Frankfurt. There are parallels, but the difference in the victims' profiles cannot be minimized. precisely because there is speculation that this is also a sexual offense by Seel. But I just mentioned that the investigators speculate that he may have had a partner. And there is even someone who, purely theoretically, could be linked to Manfred Seel in the murders, but it's all purely speculative. Manfred Seel had a clearing out company, and his business partner was called Werner Lederer. Together, the two rented several garages for their business. This included the garage where the body parts were found. Lederer also died in 2014, shortly before Manfred Seel, which is why he could never be questioned. The landlord of the garage told the investigators, however, that he had seen the two of them together in the garage, pottering about, as he put it. In addition, the police are still looking for other possible storage sites, because the garage was only rented in 2008. But Britta Simone Diallo, whose body parts were found in the Blue Barrel, was murdered in 2004. This means, in turn, that this barrel must have been somewhere else before. But where? That is also the question of the investigators, and they are calling today for anyone who has any connections or information about Manfred Seel, his cars, or possible rented storage space to contact them. The landlord of the garage also added that Seel was no longer in the garage so often after the death of his partner. Only on Saturdays, but even then, only briefly. Of course, it is also entirely possible that Werner Lederer was innocent, and that Manfred Seel no longer visited the garage so often because he had terminal cancer, and his business partner was no longer there and he no longer wanted to or was able to continue the two of them clearing out. However, an interesting statement was made by a former friend of Manfred Seel in 2016 in Der Spiegel. He says that he also founded a clearing company with Seel in the 70s, which was not successful and did not last long. But that's how he met Seel and Lederer. He also said that the two were like a symbiosis. One could not do without the other, and both were severely alcoholic. Manfred was said to have been under Werner Lederer's spell, and the latter is said to have always given instructions that Seel would have followed blindly. If this statement is true, then the speculation regarding Lederer's complicity would be brought to the fore a little. But since this cannot be verified, it is pure speculation. In October 2017, it was announced that Seel had been ruled out as a possible perpetrator of Tristan's death, because fingerprints of his, some of which were taken from an exhumation of his body, and others from a clarinet of his, did not match the bloody fingerprint on the school notebook found in the tunnel. Therefore, the public search for the boy with the ponytail was reopened. Another possible suspect is Christian B. Many will recognize the name, but for those who don't know who he is, here is a brief summary. Christian B. received a lot of media attention in 2020 after being considered a suspect in the Maddie McCain case. He was born in Würzburg in 1977 and grew up in a home there. He trained to be a car mechanic but dropped out. Probably due to a lack of prospects, he came into contact with the law early on. By his mid-20s, he already had 17 entries in his criminal record, from theft to forgery, drug trafficking, possession of weapons, and crimes involving children. He was charged with everything. In 1994, he was convicted for the first time for the last refugee, but only got 2 years probation, after which he traveled to the Algarve with his girlfriend. This is also where the connection to Maddie is to be drawn, because she was kidnapped there at the hotel complex. On the ground, the two kept their heads above water with odd jobs, until Christian B. was transferred back to Germany at the end of the 90s and had to serve a prison sentence there. After his prison sentence, he traveled to Portugal again. As you can see, he traveled a lot between Germany and Portugal, and when he was in Germany, he often traveled between Braunschweig, Hanover, and Augsburg. Shortly after he moved back to Portugal after his prison sentence, he raped a 72-year-old American woman there on September 2nd, 2005. In October 2011, he was once again given a suspended sentence, not for the attack on the American woman, but for trafficking. He was only convicted and came to the attention of investigators in the various criminal cases after his conviction in 2017 for the case just discussed, in which he was convicted on the basis of DNA evidence. Because he was on the road so much, had various image files, and had also rented different rooms and buildings, he is linked to many cases. He is linked to Tristan because the sketch of the man with the ponytail bears a strong resemblance to the mugshot of Christian B. It could also be speculated that Frankfurt is theoretically on the way between Augsburg and Hanover, and that he may have made a stop there. The following was written in the Frankfurter Neue Presse. According to information from the BKA, the murderer could have been in Frankfurt or one of the surrounding communities in the main Taunus district at the time of the murder of Tristan Brübach. However, a connection between Christian B and Tristan is only drawn based on speculation and the phantom image. And that's why I didn't want to go into Christian B any further at first. But I wanted to mention him for the sake of completeness. I will provide updates if there is any news. And that's the end of the chronology and the possible theories that arise from the factual situation. I have really tried to describe everything in as much detail as possible. What follows is Harun's personal insight. Harun knew Tristan and Frankfurt at the time. The Tristan case is very close to his heart, which is why he got in touch with me. As already mentioned, I checked the authenticity of his story as well as possible. Nevertheless, I would like to point out that it is only a subjective insight into his past. He wants to remain unrecognized, which is why his voice is distorted. Harun will discuss the situation in Frankfurt in detail after the murder of Tristan in order to better understand the extent and the exceptional situation. He will also describe his relationship in the various situations with Tristan and give his theory on the case. He ends his remarks with an encounter he had in 2015. An encounter that is really interesting, or rather, the outcome of which, as so often mentioned, is only a subjective assessment. I made a conscious decision to structure the video this way, and I'll say goodbye now and hand over to Harun. If you've enjoyed the video so far, please leave a like, comment, and/or subscribe. I make these videos completely on my own, and with just a few mouse clicks and a few written words, you really support the channel enormously, and it allows me to continue producing such documentaries for you. Thank you very much in advance. And with that, I'll hand over to Harun.
After Tristan was killed, there was a real sense of panic. It was a fear that could have been grasped. There were so many police in Frankfurt, especially in Höchst and the surrounding area, and so many checks were carried out that people were really panicking. They locked their children at home, locked themselves at home because the extent of the injuries inflicted on Tristan were so incredibly cruel that there was a fear that something like that could happen again within a very short time. And there were so many police in Frankfurt and the surrounding area that I suspect that at that time, street crime, drug-related crime, had been reduced to zero. There was a tangible, palpable fear and a panic, helplessness combined with powerlessness. It was impossible to define. You can't imagine what it was like. I myself was not allowed to go to school for days, and if I wanted to go to school, I could only be taken there and picked up again, by taxi, because the fear was just so great that something like that could have happened at any time. I met Tristan in 1997, at the end of September, beginning of October, rather by chance. Was 11 years old at the time. Tristan was a bit older, I think almost 2 years, and since I was in a school pedagogical home institution, which is in Frankfurt-Hausen, a district near Höchst. In between is Rödelheim-Sassenheim. To get there you have to take the bus to Rödelheim and then change again to get to Hausen. But as a young boy, I didn't always decide to take the direct route to the facility, but also to stroll around the station, dawdle, go into shops, of which there are many there, buy sweets and then sit down in the nearby park, where Dahlbergstrasse runs parallel, and spend time there. And then, sometime at the beginning of October, I was sitting there in this park, and Tristan approached me and asked me what I was doing there. I replied that I didn't want to go home yet, and that I was staying in a home, and not everyone there was always very nice, and that's why I decided to stay outside for a moment longer. And so we got to know each other, ate sweets together, had something to drink. Tristan had cash and cigarettes with him, but I wasn't interested in that at the time. And we talked, and a more or less superficial platonic friendship developed from it. In this this context, I also got to know his best friend Boris at a later point, but he never really spent time with us in the park himself. The park is very visible, and not somehow closed because it runs parallel to Dahlbergstrasse. And so it happened that sometimes we spontaneously, or deliberately, arranged to hang around a bit after school and sit together in this park. So it happened that after we had met several times, sometimes by appointment, sometimes spontaneously, by chance, because we both had school out, at the end of November, there was a very emotional, questionable, thought-provoking situation for me in retrospect. I was sitting with him in the park. He was a very cool, open-minded boy, and during our conversation, he asked me if I wanted a cigarette. I said yes, took one from him, and then tried to impress him by taking a drag on it and almost choking on it. It was a mixture of coughing, laughing, and being laughed at by Tristan. After I had calmed down again, and he had also stopped laughing, because we both found it kind of funny, and then he said to me, "You better leave it alone. If you can't do it, don't do it." In this context, I asked him how it was that he had so much pocket money, because he was very generous and liked to share it with his friends or in his immediate surroundings, whether it was in the park or wherever, how it came about that he had such funds. Tristan replied that he had a friend who was very nice to him, and that he met up with him from time to time. I was amazed and asked him how it could be that if you meet up with someone and spend time with them, you get pocket money, sweets, and cigarettes in return. And then Tristan replied to me, "If you want, you can meet him too." And I was never in this park for very long. I never wanted to go to. If you're late, you get an hour of detention for 1 minute, and each additional minute is added accordingly. The only thing I can say is that the time I spent with him, talking together, laughing together, trying to smoke a cigarette with him, eating sweets and drinking, was always very funny, very harmonious, very fun. He was an extremely nice guy, a dear, nice guy, and not at all introverted. That's why it makes the whole thing all the sadder when you think about the fact that you get a statement. I have a friend who is very nice to me, and when I meet up with him from time to time, I get cash, cigarettes, and something to drink in return. That still sends shivers down my spine today. I have to say, though, that for me personally, there was a very specific reason why I was never in this park, in this Bruno Aschenlage, which runs parallel to Dahlbergstrasse, and is not far from Hook's train station, for very long. The actual intention of this park was that you could retreat, sit there, relax a bit, and maybe recover from everyday stress. This park was misused in its purpose. This means that it was known there, both today and in the past, in Frankfurt and the surrounding area, that drug addicts, fixers, and other subjects met there and pursued their practices and inclinations. That's why it was clear to me from the beginning that I would never stay there after a certain time anyway. And even though the park is freely visible, you still had the option of using the railway line, which runs parallel to it, to remain anonymous. There was no fence back then. It was added later. There were very thick undergrowth and bushes, and whenever you walked by you could always hear the crackling in the hedges and bushes. And of course, as mentioned before, people with their inclinations and practices also stayed there. So it was a mixture of creepy, a test of courage, and not necessarily recommended as a shortcut to get to the city center in Hoogst. I also have to tell you, Insolito, a strange, frightening story that happened to me again. Not only was I in contact with Tristan and gained my experiences with him, and I am deeply dismayed by the way he was taken from us. When I got to the bridge, I could hear metallic noises coming from the barred fence on my left below me. I was scared to death and then looked underneath and saw a man standing in front of the fence, rattling, about to gain access to it. I immediately screamed at him in panic and total tension, and asked what his intentions were there. The man then replied that I had a problem with him, and that it was none of my business. Such strange behavior. I then replied, because I was totally energized, I also became very aggressive, of course from the point of view that I had a connection to Tristan, that I could show him right away what kind of problem I had with him if he didn't leave immediately. And then the man across from me answered what kind of problem I had with him, and then I said, I can just knock out your lights, my friend. What reason do you have to be there at that time of night, and what intentions are you pursuing? He then said, That's none of your business, ran up the small embankment, grabbed his mountain bike, sat on it, and cycled away relatively quickly. I was in a state of shock and panic, and then I ran after him. Since he couldn't see me because this section is relatively dark, I naturally had an advantage, and then followed him practically on the same route as I had come. He then used the underpass at Hoogst to practically get to the other side of the train station, Adolfhäuserstrasse, Dahlbergstrasse, where the park is. After I arrived on the other side, of course not as fast as a cyclist, I could see him at the bus station. I then went to the bus stop, keeping a safe distance, and waited there with him without him seeing me, and then got on the bus with him, line 55 to Frankfurt-Rudolheim. Meanwhile, I had decided to call the police because this action, this situation, and this event was absolutely suspicious for me. Strange to the point of creepy. Why a person would be at this place at this time of night, and for inexplicable reasons, since it is barred, and there is actually no logical reason to be there. So I got on the bus with him, had called the police, briefly described the situation to them, and that was also known to them in the control center, the thing with Tristan, that I had a personal connection to him, and explained the facts to him, that someone was just about to gain access to the tunnel. So they had asked me to stay calm, at a safe distance, and the police had instructed me to follow him, and then report to them when and where he got off. At the Sossenheim Bahnhof stop, the man decided to get off. The creepy thing was that I got off with him, and asked him again to stop, to which the man replied that I had no idea what kind of problem I had with him, and why I was following him the whole time. And then I replied that we would sort this out right now in the presence of the police. Before he could run away, the police were already on the scene. 2 patrol cars arrived, 4 officers, and subjected him to a personal check. I was lucky enough to be standing a bit apart at that moment, because I was really very tense, and about to lose my human composure. Actually, nothing happened, until after the man's personal details had been established. I was lucky enough to be standing next to one of the 4 officers, and to overhear over the radio what data had come up about him as a result of the personal details check. The man was known for violating the Narcotics Act and for other criminal offenses, so he had already been arrested for theft, assault, and that's what made my hair stand on end. Harassment and coercion. At that moment, it was like a curtain fell over my eyes, and I thought to myself, who knows, maybe I just met someone here because my search for useful clues, as well as any new updates in this matter with Tristan, because you are somehow personally affected by it, has never stopped. I immediately thought to myself, my God, could it be that someone here, just by chance, ran into me who might have something to do with it? The fact is, after the identity check, the man was allowed to leave because he was not actually guilty of any crime. What actually scared me about the whole thing is the fact that although the police complied with my request, and the request to follow this man in any way, but with this information in the context, nothing really great was done, since I also had the feeling that they were a bit overwhelmed. For me, one question arises quite clearly. Why would someone visit this place at a time that makes no sense to me? And in any case, unless you are somehow a technician, or someone from the building authority and have the key to access the Niederbach tunnel. Otherwise, this whole action makes no sense to me. Of course, this also leads me to a conclusion, that the description of the man is also very interesting. There is a sequence in which Tristan is seen alive for the last time, in the presence of a male person, about 1.80 meters tall, black hair, white top, black trousers. As soon as he turns into the camera's view and realizes that he has been recorded, he turns away to the right. Tristan goes to the phone alone and calls his father. I think that they should have definitely emphasized the call more, where a man practically calls the police and says that he's about 1.80 meters tall, has long black hair, and that he was the one who took Tristan's life. Of course, There are different views on whether this was a copycat or not. The description of the man I had seen in 2015 also matched the description of the person who had called that day. Not only the Hessian accent, but also the outward appearance, as well as the completely strange behavior, which to this day remains a mystery to me. As I said, this was an incident that has haunted me from that day to this, and I keep asking myself, what could have been done given the man's police record? Assault, theft, drug law violations, sexual harassment and coercion.